Hi, I'm Andrew Rodriguez, and welcome to Psychobible. In my intro video, I mentioned that I work at several different counseling practices, and one of them is Day 7 Ministries. We're a Christian counseling practice that specializes in sexual issues, anything sexual or relational. So, as part of my job there as a counselor, sometimes I get invited to do some speaking engagements. So, here's a talk I did on July 15th at Elizabethtown Brethren in Christ. That's in Lancaster County, and they invited me to come speak there as part of their Sunday school series on being Jesus' hands and feet in the culture. So they wanted to have someone speak about helping people address sexual uh, wholeness in a sexually broken world. So here's the talk. Just fair warning, at the beginning there's some audio problems during my introduction, or the person introducing me, but it kicks back, the speakers or the microphone kicks in and everything works out. So here you go.
Good morning, everyone. And again, I do my little plea, if you're able and willing to move up here, we are not going to hurt you. To have you come up here, it just makes it easier for our speaker when you're a little closer. I'm really excited today as we continue our series about being Jesus to a broken world and to the struggles that we have here in the church and in our community, to have Andrew Rodriguez here from Day 7 Ministries. And there is a table when you leave here, just right outside the door out there. Andrew's put some information about Day 7 Ministries there, so you might want to check that out. And also, that would be a place to talk to Andrew afterwards. Andrew is started with Day 7 Ministries in 2006, so you've been with them for a little bit of time. And he completed his BS in psychology from what is now known as University of Valley Forge. With his training at Day 7, he launched a group at his college campus for men dealing with sexual abuse and other trauma, including addiction and unwanted same-sex attraction, which he continues to run today, among many other things, some of which he'll probably share with you. He's passionate about guiding believers into understanding and walking in their identities in Christ. In addition to counseling, Andrew and his wife are youth directors, youth pastors at their church called North Point Christian Church in Trapp, or Troop, is that how you say it? True North Christian Church in Trapp. Okay, and he can, someone knows where Trapp is, so he can tell you where that is. So Andrew, we're so glad to have you here. Come on up and share with us today.
Thank you. Okay, good, I'm on. Okay, so I was asked to speak about sexual wholeness in a very sexually broken and permissive world, and it's a very broad topic. It's a big topic and an important topic. So I won't be able to get very detailed today. So I want to give some broad strokes. I want to go over a couple things that are foundational to this topic, that when you get those, then you can apply the details. And I'll give some practical insights near the end as well. So I want to go over, how is the world sexually broken? How did it get this way? Just briefly. And what is a positive reason for pursuing sexual integrity and sexual purity and sexual wholeness? What is a positive aspect to that? And then, like I said, some broad strategies. I'll get into that as well. So just like Daleen said, I had actually interned at Day 7 back in 2006 as an undergraduate. Now, I normally didn't take undergraduate interns back then, or at all, really, because you're not really allowed to do counseling at that point. So, but it was a very unique counseling experience for me, and I knew the director at the time. It was a different director. He was also an adjunct professor at Lancaster Bible College, and when I was in high school, I took some classes with him, so I was like his teacher's pet back then. So he actually encouraged me to continue in this field when I was in high school. So when it came time for my internship, I'm like, hey, can I get an internship there? And so that was a real blessing for me because I got to participate in our recovery groups And being involved in those groups, and then coming back to my campus in the fall, and then encountering more and more of my friends or friends of my wife's that I was just getting to know who were dealing with these same issues that I was just at day 7 dealing with. And God put on my heart to start a recovery group for guys, an accountability and support group for guys dealing with homosexuality. But the problem was the school didn't want anything to do with it. The director of student life at the time said, no way. I had to actually go to war for this. And that's one aspect of the church where we, for many years, didn't want to touch these issues. Whether you're talking about sexual addiction or same-sex attraction or even sexual abuse, we don't want to talk about it. We don't even want to actually provide help for it because it's like, well, if there's a group for it, then they'll just go to that group and not come to us when they mess up and then receive discipline. And it's like the philosophy was totally in opposition to where I was coming from. It's like we provide help for people and restoration and reconciliation, not punishment. That's not how you're going to help people. So I was dealing with that old mindset. And thank God things have changed in the administration there over the years, so now I can actually tell that story without fear of being punished, because for so long I had to keep that on a down low. Actually, another professor and I, he had a like mind, and so we started a group together before we actually were able to start one officially. Because at first the school made a requirement, well, if you start a group, whenever a student confesses that they watched porn or they acted out sexually, you have to report it to us. So I'm like, that's not going to help. No one's going to share anything. So I had to battle against that old mindset. So that's one part of my background. The other part is, if there's not many copies of it, but there's a newsletter in the back from day 7, and in there I have my story. Because then after years of running that group, helping guys with sexual addiction, unwanted same-sex attraction, I was like, all right, it's time for me to get my master's so I can actually do this work full time. I'm working a regular job, and then after work, I'm leading this group after I graduated. So I'm like, God, I feel more alive when I'm doing this work. I want to be able to invest in this full time. And so I started grad school, and I went to an inclusive Catholic university. It turned out it was a very secular Catholic university. And even though I was open during my entire time there about the work I do and my stance on homosexuality, didn't become an issue until 4 weeks away from graduating. And then it became an issue. And eventually I got kicked out of the school. Still graduated though because I had enough credits at the time, but I had to go to Cairn University to finish things up. So on one hand, I've had to deal with things in the church world that doesn't want to touch the issue of sex and sexual issues, and then the world that just wants to affirm everything. And so here we are as a church who, well, where's God's will? What is God's desire? Is it just to just affirm everything and let it go? Or is it hold a strong line? So how do we get to this point? All right, so the problem. In ancient times, like the ancient Near East, the ancient Middle East, the whole context in which God took Abraham and formed a nation out of him, men just gratified their sexual urges any way they pleased. It was just rampant. Didn't matter even who the partner was, if it was male or female, if it was a human or animal. That was just, hey, we have these desires, let's do whatever we want with them. There's no constraint, there's no boundary around it. That was the context in which God called Abraham forth, and then eventually he set standards with them, and then with Moses gave the law. So God's law to the Jews of containing sex to one man or one woman in marriage was actually revolutionary. That was a revolution, to put sex in a container and give it a proper direction and context. It definitely was different from the rest of the world. We're so used to that fact that that's the norm because that didn't just stop with Judaism, it spread to Christianity, and then we popularized the rest of the world, and that became our norm. But even today, if you go to a country that did not have a Judeo-Christian ethic in its foundation, you go to Thailand, you're not going to see the same appreciation for men and women and for the sexual morals. So you see that God's law was there to actually, well, one, it fulfills a greater purpose, and we'll get into that, but it actually protects us from ourselves. And not only established the family unit that then preserves society. If you understand, the family unit is the most basic element of society. It not only preserved that, but it also elevated women. Because when men can just use their sexual urges any way they want, women are on the periphery. But when God says, no, you can only use your sexual appetites and direct them in marriage toward a woman, that actually elevated the role of women. So, now the problem is, the Judeo-Christian norm, or the ethics, became the norm. And the sort of the rules that went along with that became so integrated in our culture that we almost forgot that we were in that. It's like a fish who's in water and doesn't know what water is. So when all we know are the rules and what the standards are and the institutions, but we don't know the reasons why they're there, and we don't know the greater purpose for our sexuality, it can be very easier for us to then, well, I'm just going to let my urges out in other ways. So you see what happened, there's a social enforcement. Society actually all agreed, for the most part, on the same sexual ethics, but that didn't take care of the carnal flesh, the sinful nature in man. So when all we have are just rules, it's the desire to go against God's law and just satisfy the flesh any way we want is still going to seep out. It's going to find an outlet. And so for years, we look at the good old days, like say the 50s, and we think, well, those are the good old days before the sexual revolution. But there wouldn't have been a sexual revolution if there wasn't something else that was going on below the surface. So, like we had, maybe it was common to have a mistress for years, as long as you kept it a secret, as long as you still stayed married to your wife. So we made some allowances for people. So you got certain sexual abuses. And then you have, at the same time, Puritanism. This idea that, okay, we're just going to be worried about our behavior and keeping it pure. And these sexual desires, they're bad. Just keep them stuffed down. Yes, they're good for procreation, so we'll have families, but we're not supposed to actually enjoy sex. And we're not going to talk about it. And we're not going to talk about the longings that come up. So we'll just squash that as much as we can. Well, when you do that, it's not going to last. And so eventually, there was a sexual revolution, which is still going on. So the problem is we established a norm in the institution of marriage and what sex should go into, but we failed to nest it in the context of God's divine purpose for sex. And so without vision, people perish. And people's hearts weren't into following the rules except for the social convention. And as you do a sexual revolution, eventually society changes enough that, hey, you know what? We don't have to get married. We don't have to have sex just in marriage. We don't have to wait until marriage to have sex. It becomes more and more socially acceptable. Now, to believe that sex is just for marriage is now the minority. So a lot of the sins that were growing below the surface and festering now they're no longer in secret. Now then you have people like Alfred Kinsey, who did a bunch of sex research in the 50s, and really put a spotlight on all the sexual immorality that's going on below the surface. And then now it's like, why do we have to keep this a secret anymore? Let's just let it all out. So that's what we're in now. Well, then you get the radical feminism. First wave feminism, not so bad, fighting for equal rights. Second wave feminism started this trend where, well, no, since men for years could do whatever they wanted sexually, we want to do the same thing. So, what men were doing for years was wrong. It was a violation of what God's standards were. Now you're saying, let's do it like them. That's just going to create chaos. And now we're in this situation where you wanted sexual liberation, you have it, and now you've got a rape culture at universities. You've got, well, we don't know if we really consented or not because we're drunk. all the problems we create when we take sex outside of the container God put it in. So the fruits are sexual chaos and confusion. When we take sex outside God's design for it, we're reaping those fruits. We're now in a sexual crisis. So sexual sin is everywhere. So one thing, whenever I talk about sin, I talk about sin in a very broad sense, but I always want to go back to definitions. Who knows what this word sin means? In Hebrew, it's, and I'm probably going to butcher the pronunciation, it's like hatach, and then, which means to fall off the right path. And then in Greek, it's hamartia. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly either, but that means to miss the mark. Now, when I was in high school, I went on a missions trip with Youth with a Mission, and that was in El Paso, Texas, and actually we were in Juarez, Mexico. And we do training first before we go out and do evangelism and outreach. And that was one of the first lessons. What is sin? And one of the other students, who was actually from Canada, he's like, in archery terms, it means to miss the target. And it always stuck with me. When you think about that, why do people miss the target? Now, we tend to think, well, it's because they're wicked and evil. They want to miss the target. They hate God so much, they just want to miss it. But we're going to get into a little bit, there's multiple reasons why people might miss the target. So, but the main point right now I want to make is we don't know what sin is if we don't know what the target is. We can't identify what sexual sin is if we don't know what God's design and intent for sex is. We need to know what those are. Because we're going to run into more and more situations that just seem like, well, what's God's answer to this? Like in college, I had a friend or acquaintance who, it came out that he practiced vampirism. Like he was dating a friend of ours, and it creeped her out. He came to her one day, it's like, hey, I'm into this thing where I drink blood. Is it okay if I do that to you sometime? And she's like, what? He's like, yeah, just take a little razor, slice your neck, and I drink your blood for a bit. And it's like, well, what's that? What's the biblical answer to that? And it's like, I think there's like a sexual aspect to it. And it's like, the world's going to come up with so many more things. But the reality is nothing is new under the sun. It's just without the constraints and without the social aspects and without the Holy Spirit, we're just going to revert back to the way things were in ancient times. So, getting more and more rampant with our sexual immorality. So we need to know what is God's purpose and intent for sexuality. So, we actually need a new sexual revolution that returns to biblical sexuality. And it has to start with the understanding of the way God created us. It can't just be rules. We can't just have rules like, don't have sex in this way, don't have sex in that way. Reserve sex for this. It's like those are the rules, but the rules have to be nested in a story, actually. We actually live our lives not by concepts, abstract ideas. We live our lives by stories. We care about narratives. People need to know what role they play in a greater story. And most people haven't been told the great role they played in the story. So that's the second part I want to get into, is what is the positive aspect to pursuing sexual purity and wholeness and integrity? That God actually has a plan for your sexuality, and is magnificent and it's good. And our bodies actually tell this story. It's no mistake we're created male and female. And in fact, when God said, let us make man in our image, the next thing he says is, let us make them male and female. So now we just think, well, that's just so that they can procreate. Yes, that's an aspect of it. But there's something about the very fact we're made male and female that is a reflection of God. And it speaks to our relationship to God. Our sexuality, our maleness and femaleness reflects God. Yeah. The Trinity is a clue to us that God is relational in nature. He's in constant loving relationship. And then when he creates humanity, he's like, I want to make more creatures that can participate in this loving relationship. And also, because we're so loving, well, it's easy to love each other. We're awesome. God, it's easy for God to love the other members of the Trinity. But boy, let's create people who actually rebel against us and still show our great love to them. So his just is demonstrated even more in his creation of us. So that's one thing that we learn, that our bodies, because we're relational, reflects the relational nature of God. But also, the fact that there's two sexes reveals God's relationship to us. There's an overarching story and narrative in Scripture from the beginning to the end that God actually wants to marry us. It started with, in the garden, put Adam and Eve there. It starts with the marriage between Adam and Eve. Then throughout the Old Testament, you see God refer to the nation of Israel as his bride, as his wife, as his wayward wife, the wife who's prostituting herself. She's being unfaithful to him. Then in Jesus, first miracle he performs is at a wedding. And then he speaks of his return, coming as a bridegroom. He uses the parables of the virgins and the bride waiting for the bridegroom. And we see that culminating in the Revelation with the wedding feast that we get to enjoy. God created us to be his bride. So our bodies are meant to be symbols of that story. Symbols are important, and we've lost appreciation for them in especially our Western culture. But it's so important to understand what they mean, what they point to. So, sexual desire. Sexual desire is meant to be a hint that erotic desire that's in us is meant to be a guide towards our ultimate fulfillment in Christ. It's only meant to be a taste. Any pleasure that you receive in this life, the two greatest pleasures, sex and food, the most basic pleasures you could ever experience, as awesome as they are, and I love sex and I love food, as good as they taste, they're nothing compared to the pleasure that we're going to experience in heaven in marriage to Christ. The fulfillment. It's every little bit of fulfillment we receive on this earth is just supposed to be a taste. It's just as on earth there was the earthly temple, in heaven there was a heavenly temple. Well, our bodies are a temple as well, so they're meant to be a shadow of what we're going to experience in heaven. So our desires, that desire for sex, that doesn't always get satisfied. And even when you satisfy it for a bit, it's just a matter of time before it comes back up again. It's only meant to point us back to what our design is. And then our design speaks to us about our destiny. So desire points to your design, which then reveals our destiny, our eternal destiny. Another thing I want to get into, and I'll probably go over this briefly for time's sake, is our God-given longings. This is so important when it comes to, okay, why do people sin? It's not always just because, well, they hate God. Well, in a way, if you see it as, yes, they don't love God more than themselves, yes. But we see, when God first created man, he was made to reflect God and glorify God. That is the highest purpose of man. And in reflecting and glorifying God, we had certain blessings. We had safety and security, peace and harmony. We had love and belonging, identity and honor, power and purpose, freedom and fun, and wisdom and understanding, maybe to a lesser extent. But those were blessings that we had. But then after the fall, those blessings became longings. And everyone experiences the fulfillment of those longings to different degrees. And we try to pursue fulfillment of those longings in different ways. And some people may have more fulfillment in a certain area than others, and so they can have pride in that area, or they can be greedy in that area, or they lack, or even if they have plenty, they could still feel like they lack. They don't have enough. What was it, Rockefeller who said, someone asked, how much money is enough? And he just said, a little bit more. Like, you can never satisfy these longings because they're only supposed to be blessings of the actual purpose to glorify and reflect God. So, our sexuality actually stretches across all of these different longings. There's an aspect to each of these longings that overlaps with our sexuality, such as safety and security. What happens when you've been violated sexually? That messes with your whole sense of safety. What happens if you don't believe you haven't been affirmed in your identity as male or female? You struggle with your sexual identity. When you've become addicted to the pleasure of sex, well, you have too much fun. You've become, you fear restraint. You want to be free to just pursue it any way you want. So we see this overlap. So why do we miss this mark? Well, we live in a fallen world. We have fallen bodies, we have diseases, we have chromosomal abnormalities, we have all sorts of other biological issues. We have wounds and deficits. We have a lack of revelation. We lack understanding of what our sexuality is meant for. And then we have the fear and pride that we were getting into, the different fears of fulfilling certain longings. So what does the gospel have to do with our sexuality? The gospel actually gives an answer to both versions. As I gave in my story, that I was dealing with a school and a church mentality that said, no, let's not talk about sex. Let's squash it. And that's called the starvation diet. I'm using some words from Christopher West. He's a Catholic theologian who talks about the theology of the body. And I heard him speak a few years ago, and just everything clicked. All these things I've been teaching, but I was missing a few elements here and there, and it clicked. And that's our background, the Puritanism, the attitude, for the most part, living in Lancaster County all my life, for the most part, of, no, we don't talk about sex, and we don't talk about these issues, we'll squash it. Well, guess what? That's not working. I have a client who, or had a client, who, from Philadelphia, but he was adopted by a Mennonite family, so he's been living in Amish country and Mennonite country most of his life, and he struggles with same-sex attraction. Boy, the stuff he tells me. There's an undercurrent in the Mennonite community of sexual sin and homosexuality that people aren't addressing. I would say it's because it's not talked about. When it's in secret, it can grow. There's a whole culture, subculture going on. It's gonna break free at some point soon, even in Lancaster County, if we don't have the answer. Well, if the world, they know they have these sexual desires and longings, and you just tell them not to engage in them, not to fulfill them in any way, that's not going to satisfy them. And even the good Christian knows that's not the answer, because you can't just get rid of them by ignoring them. So what are they going to do? We're going to try to fulfill it in some way. So we go to the next available thing. And it's usually it's what we call fast food. It's just, I want to fulfill this right now. I'm in a rush. So let's get what we can now. I have this client I'm going to see in my church who he's dealing with all this stress and anxiety and depression. And I'm like, so what are you going to do about it? He's like, I just need to get laid. Just need to get laid? Yeah, that'll make me happy. That'll make me happy. Like, really? That's going to do it? Well, what then? What after that? I don't know. They don't calm down. I never had sex yet. Well, what's the purpose of sex? Stop asking me questions. I just want to get laid. He's worshiping the appetizer when he should be saving himself for the main course. So that's a fast food diet, because you can have that sexual pleasure now, but it won't satisfy you, so you keep going back for more. And then that goes away, so you keep going back for more. And that's how we get into sexual addiction, when you're trying to satisfy an eternal longing with something temporal. The greater purpose of our sexual desires that God put inside us is to direct us toward the eternity. So there's times when I'm struggling, and even in marriage, where the lust comes up, and I'm really like, God, help me remember in those moments that really it's you giving me a reminder that I'm meant for something greater. Help me to use that longing to direct me toward longing for you. Because guess what? Even in marriage, your sexual desires won't be always fulfilled. She's sick. You're sick, so she can't kiss you. I'm just getting over a cold. Haven't been able to kiss my wife for a week. It's torture. So you never know. She might get paralyzed. She might be in a coma. Are we just to satisfy our sexual natures, or are we supposed to realize that they are just meant to be a symbol, an icon of the greater fulfillment we'll have in heaven? But when we turn our worship toward the icon, they become idols. So we've made an idol out of sexuality. And so what is it that we offer? Are we offering those rules or a relationship? Greater than our rules is a relationship to God. Are we getting the rituals or revelation of what the true purpose of sex is? All right, so I'm going to try to wrap up here in the next few minutes with some strategies for sexual wholeness. As you're being in God's hands and feet, think in these terms. What are the needs of the people I'm ministering to? What are their longings that aren't being fulfilled? Is it love and belonging? Is it that they don't have a place they can call their home? Is it because, keep this in mind. People dealing with sexual struggles, such as sexual addiction and same-sex attraction, sexual issues have non-sexual roots. It's not always because they just love sex so much. No, they're fulfilling a greater longing. They're just fulfilling the easiest way, the most available way. You can't get something more available than sex, even if it's just by yourself. I work with guys who have overcome drug and alcohol addiction, but kicking the porn addiction and the masturbation and the lust addiction is the hardest thing for them. Usually it's their first addiction. It's their first love. It's the most accessible thing, and you don't even need to have porn anymore. Once you've looked at it enough, you've got stuff in your, what guy he calls it, his spank bank. So it's just in there. Your mind captures these images. They don't go away, not so easily. And they can get triggered very easily. So safety and security, what are the needs for that? They need boundaries and structure. Things like accountability software really helps. Things like putting limits on places you can go. Now, one thing I go over with my guys is we go over figuring out their triggers. And then, okay, let's take those triggers and let's put them into a few groups. Which are the ones that you could probably do without the rest of your life and you just straight up avoid? Okay, well, going to a strip joint, you can probably avoid that the rest of your life. Good. All right, what are ones that you could work at reducing the impact of that trigger? Okay, and what are the ones where we can eliminate that as a trigger so it no longer has an effect on you? So we try to figure those out. And you need structure for them. You need boundaries. Peace and harmony. It's so important that we have, I wish I could get into this more. It's been on the forefront of my thoughts most recently. Especially now, my church, we're starting an outreach to girls to help them understand what their true femininity is. So I've been doing all this research on what it means to be a woman, and on biblical sexuality and biblical femininity, and I've been teaching on biblical masculinity for years, but now I'm like, all right, God, what does it mean to be a woman? And so I'm studying the scriptures on that, and so it's so important to understand what actual biblical sexuality is, and also to serve others and bring justice to others. I know you guys were talking about sex trafficking recently. That's an aspect of bringing peace and harmony back into the world. Love and belonging. People need meaningful relationships in all spaces of belonging. In a public sense, a corporate sense, you need to feel like you belong to a community. We also need a smaller unit as well. Jesus had the 12, and then of the 12, he had the 3 that he was most intimate with. So you need spaces throughout your life of belonging and meaningful relationships in them. Identity and honor. This is probably the most key, is heal the shame. All right, I got 1 minute. I'm going to make this really important point. Shame is the fuel of sexual addiction, as well as homosexuality. See, the sexual addiction cycle, if it starts, shame builds up. Shame is this sense, it's not just guilt. Guilt is an evaluation of your behavior. Shame is an evaluation of you as a person. And when you're dealing with an issue like this, or any other issue in your life, where you feel like there's something wrong with you, and it makes you unlovable to others, and unacceptable, that builds up shame, and shame just is overwhelming. So eventually we need relief. I want to feel something good. So we go to an addiction. And it starts with just a thought. Like, okay, I'm preoccupation stage. Let me just think about it. And that brings some pleasure, but that's not enough. So we go through the rituals to fulfill that action. And just the rituals, like I'm gonna walk down this, or I'm gonna start scoping the internet. I haven't even looked at anything yet, but I'm looking, I'm searching. That brings some pleasure too. But then you act out. It feels good, but just for a moment. And then you're just left with that despair. And you're like, well, here I'm fighting this issue, but I messed up again. Adds to the shame. There must be something wrong with me. And just the cycle continues. You have to get to the root of the shame. The identity, their value. And one of the key ways to do that is to expose your shame. I'm so blessed by this church I discovered in Greenville, South Carolina, Grace Church. They've been doing all these teachings on biblical femininity. And They did a series on shame and for women, but one of the male pastors, one of the top guys, he went to that workshop and he told his own story about his own sexual struggles, how he was molested, how he developed a sexual addiction in front of a bunch of women. He exposed his shame. It's got to come from the top down. When I lead my group, I never ask the guys to share anything I'm not willing to share myself. I have to hold myself to the same standards. And usually what that does is help spark them talking, to know it's safe. All right, I'll wrap up with the last slide here. Yeah. I would just say, most is repeating some of the same things. And we want to make sure we have a healthy, sexually healthy church, that we have grace and mercy. And I'll throw this in as a freebie. When we're dealing with a culture that just says, be permissive, and we see how people are hurting because they don't match up with our sexual standards. And we see the rates of suicide among people who have sexual struggles, especially sexual identity issues. Our compulsion sometimes is to just, well, let's just affirm them. It'll make them feel better. It'll stop them from hurting themselves and hating themselves. And so we fall sometimes in the error of, let's just love them as they are. Then we see that, and we're like, no, we got to bring the truth. We have to hold to God's truth. But truth without love is just condemnation. Love without truth is just congratulating them into hell. So you need both, but if you just have both, but you don't provide help, people will despair, and they'll probably end up falling into their sin. So you need hope. Whenever I talk about these topics, you need love and truth, but you also need hope. That's what true compassion is. True compassion is to affirm the truth, affirm reality, and then provide actual help for people who want it. You don't force it on people, but you provide it for those who actually want it. That's compassion. So as you are God's hands and feet in the culture, with your family, with your neighborhoods, coworkers, demonstrate true compassion. Show his love, affirm truth, and provide actual help for those who want it. Think in terms of their longings. Which longings are not being fulfilled? How can I be an instrument to help that? So I hope that's good. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrew. I want to pray for you and your work as we close out our time. And like I said, Andrew's going to go back afterwards to the table outside the back door, and I'd invite you, if you have things you'd like to ask him about or questions, that you talk to him, or he can tell you about Day 7 Ministries as well. Let's pray. Lord.
Well, thanks for watching. If you have any thoughts or comments or questions, please feel free to join in the conversation in the comments section. I love to interact with you there. And if you're interested in more of my content, please hit subscribe. I'll see you around. God bless.